Thank you very much for being here with us this afternoon. I'm Christine Lowe. I come from Hong Kong in China. My association with RMI goes back to 1992. I was in public office then, and I remember I read somewhere that there was somebody called Lovins who wrote about this new idea called negawatts. And because I took an interest in energy issues, I decided to ask my legislative aide to look for this Mr. Lovins. Well, in those days, we didn't have emails, and I couldn't Google him. So I found a fax number to an organization called the Rocky Mountain Institute. So I faxed him, and I said, "Dear Mr. Lovins," and I wrote a very nice letter saying I need some help in looking at some aspects of how we deal with utility regulation in Hong Kong. Well, the next day, I think I got 45 pages from the fax machine. And I thought, wow, this is really amazing. I got the man. And since then, Amory's come out to Hong Kong numerous times. He has a fan club in Hong Kong. We haven't yet been able to do anything really big in China, but hopefully, in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll be able to do something really big, because obviously the time for Amory and for RMI has come. So it's my privilege to be here and to share this moment with the Rocky Mountain Institute. We're going to talk about serious and perhaps a slightly unpleasant subject this afternoon of fear and security. But I have a wonderful panel. This kind of discussion that I've been enjoying with my panel yesterday and today is actually very rare for me. It's not easy for us coming from Asia to have this quality of discussion from people who've served so long in government and people who've actually been working on the ground today, right now, in areas of conflict. So I feel very privileged to be with this panel. I don't think I need to introduce Amory to all of you, but I'd like to just introduce very briefly the rest of the panel. We have Claire Lockhart, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Institute for State Effectiveness. And her mission, the mission of her organization, is to build stability and prosperity for the 40 to 60 fragile states around the world. And in the last 7 years, Claire's actually lived and worked in difficult places, including Afghanistan and other places of conflict. Sitting next to her is Jim Woozy. He's the vice president of Booz Allen Hamilton. He's practiced law for 22 years. He's served in 5 governments over 12 years. And he is a presidential appointee under 2 Republican and 2 Democratic administrations. And next to him is Linton Wells. He is chair of Forced Transformation and distinguished research professor of the National Defense University. He is in 16 years he has served in the office of the Secretary of Defense on policy, intelligence, and information technology. He's a career naval officer. And on my right is Dr. Eric Rasmussen. He's a Navy commander with an emphasis in humanitarian medicine and the effective crossing of the civil-military boundary during disaster relief operations. He has 18 deployments, including twice in Afghanistan and 10 months in Iraq, as well as a month in New Orleans during that terrible time after Katrina. For 25 years, he's been in the Navy service. So thank you very much for being on this panel. As we talk about issues of privation, of resources, and security, I think I can have no better person to start off by kicking this off than having Amory. But what I'd like the panel to do is to help the audience frame these difficult issues. These issues can be looked at very narrowly, or they can be looked at very broadly. What I'd like to do today is to see how broadly we can take it so that we end our session today by having a better understanding as to what it is that the issues are and what it is that we can do. So Amory, over to you.
I'd like to introduce the concept of security that means freedom from fear of privation or attack. That is, how can we be safe and feel safe in ways that work better and cost less than present arrangements? And how can this condition be built from the bottom up, not from the top down, in ways that are the province of every citizen, not the monopoly of national governments, that don't rely on the threat or use of violence, that make others more secure, not less, whether on the scale of the village or the globe, and that also save enough money to pay for other needs and help to advance other overarching goals. This is clearly more than a concept of security based solely on military power. And in fact, I think at the core of it is resource efficiency, because it can turn scarcity into abundance, thereby reducing or eliminating conflict over things like oil and water and minerals. It makes aspirations to a decent life universally realistic and attainable. It can make infrastructure invulnerable by design. It also, this is a little longer conversation, can unmask and penalize proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. So in those different ways, saved resources do create a safer world and help us to achieve freedom from fear of attack through a combination of preventing or avoiding conflict, resolving it peacefully where it does arise, and defeating aggression through non-provocative defense if the first two measures fail. So we've been working on these issues for even longer than RMI has existed. It's a core part of our mission, and I'm therefore thrilled to have this wonderful panel to help us think it through.
Delighted to be here. I spent a lot of time in places like Afghanistan and have come to a very similar point to Amory's. A central proposition that stability in the most fragile parts of the world will come when citizens are embedded in relationships of trust with their governments and with the market. And I really came upon this when I was working with General Hillier, who was the Canadian commander of the 5th deployment of ISAF, the international forces in Afghanistan. And a light bulb went off for him. He had his strategic planners map the causes of insecurity in Afghanistan. And he said, you know, I've discovered something really odd. Security doesn't come from the number of tanks I deploy. Security, the key driver of security and prosperity in Afghanistan, are credible institutions and a public finance system, so a governance system. And I've been working with many of the people on this panel and others and thinking, really rediscovering public policy in these places. What are the functions of governance that citizens need to be able to establish those relationships of trust? Unfortunately, the approaches that we tend to take collectively on the ground in these places at the moment are ones that don't work. And learning from Amory's language, I think they might be nigger approaches. And some of them involve flying around and dropping bombs on villages. That's not very popular after a while. There's some tolerance for it. And still in Afghanistan, people say, please, we want a partnership with the West rather than the Russians or the Pakistanis. So they're still looking for friendship. I'll tell you a story which some Afghan villagers told to me. They said, let me tell you the story of $150 million going up in smoke. I said, tell me more. And they said, well, there's a $150 million UN agency program for shelter. We've worked out what really happens. 20% goes to Geneva for those fancy head offices. Gets subcontracted to CARE, 20% goes to Washington. Gets subcontracted again to Oxfam, 20% to Oxford. Eventually, a little bit of money is left at the bottom. And this is used to buy wooden beams from Iran, shipped up through Ismail Khan's trucking cartel. The wooden beams eventually reach our villages. They're the wrong size for our mud walls. So we chop them up and use them for firewood. Now, that's the aid system that, more or less, that currently works at the moment. And I think it needs a system redesign approach. It's not working right now. And the approaches of RMI, and I've had the benefit to learn a lot from RMI and Amory in how we could take a real systems design approach to do things very differently. And we have this great opportunity because there are 40 to 60 countries which, from a technological, scientific perspective, really are a blank slate. Do we want now to be putting in big power stations and grids, or do we want to be seeing how we can harness the knowledge and technological advances that have been made in the last few years, and finding ways to link what's going on now in these countries to the immense knowledge that's in this room and rooms like this, I think is one of the key challenges ahead. We can really link the poverty agendas to the Green Revolution. Stop there.
Please.
Thank you. Andrew said he felt a little oxymoronish being a corporate environmentalist. He should try being a spy environmentalist. Let me say that a lot of what we need to focus on is what RMI has done so well, which is concentrating on the economic benefits of moving away from polluting the planet. And a lot of what we need to focus on is what Claire addressed here very briefly, and we all want to hear more from her, I think, which is a system of energy and approaches toward it that builds trust at a local level in a place like Afghanistan. This is basically also, frankly, Thomas Jefferson's point in his argument with Hamilton. That's why Jefferson loved yeoman farmers. They were small, independent, self-sufficient. That's what that spinning wheel is doing in the middle of the Indian flag, local self-sufficiency. So that is a tremendously important contributor, it can be, toward a peaceful, sensibly operated world. Unfortunately, there are two big types of threats that we have to look at in the midst of moving in these economically sound and democratic directions. I call them malignant and malevolent. Global warming is a malignant threat. If you think of nobody's trying to make it happen to the Earth, but if you look at the tundra, the frozen tundra, and you increase the temperature by a few degrees, we don't know exactly how many, releases of methane 21 times worse than carbon dioxide. That in turn heats things up faster. Methane gets released even faster, somewhat like metastasis. So we do have in global warming, and we also have in, I think, the nature of our infrastructure, some opportunities for, unfortunately, malignant disasters. Amory, 25 years ago when I first met him and wrote the foreword to his book, Brittle Power, did a superb job of talking about the vulnerability of our energy system. And one aspect of the vulnerability is today, a tree branch falls in Ohio on a power line during a storm, and within about 90 seconds, I think about 80 gigawatts of power are offline, blacking out New England, New York, and Eastern Canada. Now, we tried to blame that on the Canadians. I guess we took a leaf from the South Park kids or something. But in their polite way, they pointed out that Ohio is, in fact, in the United States. So we sort of had to fess up. But the point is the electricity grid's a lot more vulnerable to that kind of accident now. It's so congested with the deregulation in the national electricity market than would have been the case 20 years ago when that probably would have been just an outage in Ohio. There's an added problem, though, to these malignant problems of both our transportation system, which is centered on oil, and our electricity system, the main problem of which is coal. And that is malevolence, because we are not facing just a faceless problem that is grounded only in stupidity or lack of response. We are also facing a very malevolent enemy. One of the brilliant things about Brittle Power 25 years ago was its focus on terrorism in going after our energy systems. Terrorists are a lot smarter than tree branches. They know to go after the SCADA systems. They know to go after the transformers. They know what to do in terms of attacking electricity infrastructure. And oil is, of course, a big part of the problem over in the transportation sector, because oil fuels, as Tom Friedman points out so well, much of the terrorism. It's the only war we've ever fought where we pay for both sides, not a good strategy. Oil also, as Tom has written many times, you have the phenomenon of the path of freedom and the price of oil moving in opposite directions. Witness Chavez, Ahmadinejad, etc. So there is a very fundamental problem from our reliance on oil itself, both directly and indirectly because of terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia, let's say, possibly taking down major parts of the oil infrastructure. So we have got to deal with both the malignant threats and the malevolent threats. And I'll stop with this. Most people who work on the malignant side of this, that is, dealing with an issue such as global warming, are nice people. They don't like putting themselves in the shoes of a terrorist and figuring out how to take down the electricity grid, and then that's a necessary first step to going on to figure out how to make that difficult or impossible to do. Amory's rare in being willing and able, and having demonstrated many times, to put himself in the shoes of an enemy. Most people don't like to do that. But if we only concentrate on the malignant problem, if we think the only problem is lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, if we just are a little more persuasive and break down some of the institutional barriers, people will see the light. Nonsense. We are facing a theocratic, totalitarian enemy that if you read their fatwas, and that's the only thing to read, not what they say in English to the West, but what they say in Arabic to one another, the movement, particularly the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, is theocratic, totalitarian, and genocidal. Genocidal with respect to Jews, Shiites, homosexuals, apostates, and horribly repressive with respect to everyone else, including particularly women. We have a big job on our hands in dealing with that kind of threat. We got used to dealing with totalitarian threats with a dead ideology, a quasi-economic philosophy ideology, Marxism, during the Cold War. That was easy. Those guys could be contained. They were bureaucrats. They didn't want to die from each according to his ability, each according to his need. They wanted to keep their dachas. We are facing an honest enemy, an enemy that really wants to destroy our whole way of life and is willing to do anything in order to do it. And if you focus only on the malignant problem and not also the malevolent one, you're making the problem for yourself much too easy.
Well, on that happy note, Lynn.
So to build on what Jim and Claire have said, in the mid-1980s, I was doing some critical infrastructure work for the Navy, and someone came in and said, "You got to read this book called Brittle Power." So there's a loop here as well. But some of the thoughts that struck me are twofold. First of all, I accept the stipulation that if we can get to freedom from fear of privation, that the world will be a safer place. I also accept that fear with regard to attack. The question is, first of all, what steps do we need to take to get there? What's the sequence along the path? And the second is, what's plan B in case the migration doesn't proceed as smoothly as we'd like? With regard to the malevolent threats you're talking about, do we need the sort of sysadmin force that Tom Barnett talks about for stabilization and peacekeeping? Do we need more of some sort of a Leviathan force to counter a major peer competitor? The future is uncertain. How do we hedge those bets? Also, how do we convince the U.S. defense industry that perhaps there are better investments to make than more of the high-tech equipment that we used during the era of the past era that you were speaking about, and maybe some of those dollars could be spent better. With regard to Claire's point, I think there is one pretty good example of where some of the stabilization and reconstruction has worked, and that's in the southern Philippines. And the model there is instructive because the U.S. basically went in, as I understand it, in small units working very closely with the Philippine, not just armed forces, but Philippine government. And part of the approach to the local datus, local leaders, was, what would it take for you to be neutral in this fight? You don't need to love us, but what would it take for you to be neutral? This bridge, this well, this road. And then the approach went to delivering sort of the goods, services, and money to the local Philippine NGOs, to the local Philippine government authorities. So at the end of that time, you didn't have a big American flag flying over the well. You had people's confidence and trust in their government enhanced. And that sort of leads to this point about not having us engage in the first place. So the last piece of this then is going back to the Plan B. Defense Department has made some pretty significant investments that have affected all our lives over time. The very high-speed integrated circuits, the ARPANET, the global positioning system. Are there other bets that could be made with defense investment dollars that might have comparable leverage? And perhaps energy is one at this stage. And I'd be interested in hearing the audience's thoughts on that as we go along.
Eric.
I am not policy and strategy. I'm one of those who implements. And if you'll allow me to start with a personal anecdote, I took a little vacation a few weeks ago, and I returned to my hospital, where I'm the chairman of the Department of Medicine. I had turned it over capably, came back to find an email telling me that even though I had returned from Afghanistan in March, I was to leave August 27th for 458 days in Afghanistan. That's where we've gone in rotation cycles. That's what the cost is to those who are actually serving. Keep that in mind for a moment. When the, oh, and by the way, I should preface this. I am an active duty Navy officer. I'm in uniform every day. I do not speak here today for the Department of the Navy or the Department of Defense, and they would be the first ones to tell you that. Okay? The presence of civilians in the planning for the Iraq War was a resource that was not available to most of us who were on the military side of that planning. In part, as a consequence, when we entered that war, and I was seconded to USAID at the time as the physician to the Disaster Assistance Response Team, we had a period of time where we had the civilians who would be responsible for the upcoming new government in Iraq, and the military who was going to implement the kinetic force that would lead to the change in that regime. And they could not talk to each other. Even when they had permission to do so, which was rather belated, oh, by the way, we did not have communications venues that allowed these civilians who needed to build a new country to talk with those who were going to take down the existing one. I made a list while I was in Baghdad of who could not talk with whom. And as a spider diagram with broken links, it's very impressive. It is an interesting recognition that in 2003, as in 2007, if you cannot communicate, you cannot coordinate, that's old news. And if you cannot coordinate, you cannot establish trust between those who are going to have their lives affected by what you intend to do. What Claire Lockhart does for a living is try to establish, and I'm grossly oversimplifying Claire, but is try to reestablish trust in a failed state between the population affected and the central authority responsible for their care. That kind of effort is still in its infancy. And in fact, Claire and Ashraf are the only two people I know who are really, really doing that very well. I've been fortunate to work with them for a little bit on how these things might be done better. And there is an occasional demonstration called Strong Angel that takes the lessons that have been most painful from a recent event, whether it be Kosovo or Iraq or Afghanistan or Katrina, and identify the problems and then set those problems as tasks to be solved across a very wide range of solution providers, ranging from Beltway bandits that we're all familiar with to Burning Man attendees who don't own a pair of shoes. We've found good ideas everywhere. Most recently, we've been able to bring Claire and Ashraf into that environment where we had a long list of things that were going wrong and have them take some of the proposed solutions they have in their capacity to reconstruct failed states and put them against communities reestablishing resilience. Now, that resilience is something that we needed badly in Katrina. I was the Navy's forward surgeon on the ground in Katrina. We had an enormous medical relief capacity. We had a very strong transportation logistics capacity, and we were able to coordinate in ways that are surprisingly good. Couldn't continue very well, and there are lots of things afterwards, as in the Iraq War, lots of things afterwards that have no direct bearing on that initial effort. But without the capacity to communicate and coordinate effectively across particularly the civil-military boundary, security cannot be well established because trust cannot be well established. If you don't know what the population senses that it needs, you can't respond effectively. And if you try to dictate to a population what you think they need, they're likely to get irritable. And that irritability is killing my friends.
Well, you've all shared some very complex issues with the audience. The issue of trust has come up twice from Claire and from Eric. It would be good if we could go deeper into what it means to build trust, what are the tools that we need to build trust, and who are the people who have the skills or who have the duty to do so. Jim, you talked about the two threats, the malignant and the malevolent, and you've essentially said that people who think about these things in terms of coming up with solutions, we need to hold both of them in our minds at the same time, rather than just focus on one and neglect the other. And Amory, what you have suggested is that in looking at both of them, the issue of resources and how we use resources could be a solution, and it'd be a smart solution to solving both ends of these threats. And Eric, you've shared with us what happens really on the ground, how things go wrong. Both you and Claire have given us some, and Lynn as well, you've given us some examples of where things have worked. Lynn, you've warned us about, well, we can be very high sounding, but in the end, we're going to need a lot of people to actually come up with solutions that can be carried out repeatedly. Sustained solutions on the ground. So I wondered whether we can go into some of these issues in greater depth.
Let me try as a first cut. I was very impressed by Dean Kamen's remarks in the earlier panel. I think they fit in very much with these several criteria. And let me just skip to say where I think both being resilient against malevolent threats, resilient against malignant threats, and promoting of trust at a local level come together. I think they come together in two places. One is getting off oil. We need to do to oil what electrification and refrigeration did to salt at the end of the 19th century. Salt was a strategic commodity. It mattered whether your country had salt mines. People fought wars over salt. Electricity and refrigeration came along, and salt was effectively destroyed as a strategic commodity. Now, we still import salt. We're salt independent, right? Nobody cares where the salt comes from. It's just a commodity. But nobody dominates his neighbors because he has salt mines anymore. Oil is different. Oil is the strategic commodity of the age. Power is wielded in the hands of those countries, most of them dictatorships or autocratic kingdoms that control oil. And we need to break that monopoly, oligopoly. We need to break that control. That is one of the first things. The second is, I think, with respect to electricity generation, and I think the cars will come sooner to electricity via plug-in hybrids than they will to a lot of the alternative liquid fuels, although they have a role as well. But I think in order to move towards sensible electrification, we need to move toward distributed generation. Probably almost all with renewables, the sense of thin film and nano solar, small wind turbines, the like. Because that is what will empower a village to be able to stand up to a central authority if it has its own energy and can probably purify its own water because it has its own energy. It will do a great deal for local empowerment.
Can I ask the panel, particularly for those of you who've worked in difficult areas, when you have opportunities to reconstruct, how open-minded are the people whose job it is to do the reconstruction, to think that way, to think about putting in distributed powers?
I can tell you we've had 3 failed attempts to bring distributed power to Iraqi reconstruction. Lynn and Eric and Jim, to some degree, have been active in that. And each time, even the third time when it was supported by the Iraqi power minister, it was shot down by the American authorities who said, well, we've already given these big contracts to the well-known firms.
Somebody, right? Somebody.
To build more of what we had before, and we're good at that. Of course, the bad guys keep knocking the stuff down faster than we can put it back up. So Baghdad is now in a real power crisis, maybe an hour or two of power a day. I don't know, Lynn, Eric, you may have more recent numbers, but it's very disturbing, so much so that the Pentagon has stopped reporting it. And last I looked, and I think it's got worse since then, 7 of the 9 power lines into the city had been knocked down. And the next obvious thing is somebody will blow up the big power plant and then all the lights are off. Well, of course, this could soon come to a theater near you because similar stuff can be done to our grid, and we would be back in the 7th century for a long time, if not indefinitely. But now we're having a 4th run at it in Iraq. It may be too late, but some people actually there who are in the same organizations that made bad decisions before are starting to realize, hey, isn't it odd, in the areas where we have reliable power supply, they're not very friendly to insurgents.
Claire, would you like to tell us what happens actually on the ground? I know this is exactly the sort of thing you want to promote.
Absolutely, and just one other example of where it has worked. Under the Maoist insurgency in Nepal, there was a program they only just discovered that got micro-hydro out across the villages. The villages formed a network themselves, and they put it in place across thousands of villages and just taught each other. And sometimes solar. That they didn't get too advanced with that, but the micro-hydro distributed power system was working in spite of their government and the fact that there was a full-scale insurgency going on. In Afghanistan, just to reiterate, it's when there's a bunch of reformers in place who really do want to put in place distributed power and alternative energies, again, the problems they run up against are the big contractors and the World Bank and the UN agencies. I was part of a group that went to the UN, and they said, no, alternative energy is really not practical. Went to the World Bank, and they said, not cost effective. Yeah, big power stations are the solution. Had the fortune to come actually here to Aspen in 2004 after we'd been struggling with this for 3 years, and had the fortune to run into Lynn Wells in the elevator and then spend 3 hours talking to Amory, who put me on the phone with Eric. And then I realized that this is the community that has a really radically and very important way of thinking, and we just need to find the ways to get these ideas across and implement it across these countries. Another example of something that I think has worked, it's not distributed power in the electrical energy sense, but distributed political and economic power. And a program that I think, and Eric's alluded to it, that I think is beginning to work in Afghanistan, is an approach that really says, okay, let's give the communities the benefit of the doubt. Let's trust them and see if we get trust back. And Ashraf mentioned it yesterday on the panel. National Solidarity Program says, let's empower the communities. Every community gets $20,000, and in return, they have to do very simple things. They have to elect their village council. They have to get together as a community and choose their projects. And then they have to put up an account of how they've spent the money in a public place so they can monitor each other. And this now the Afghans are calling their national tablecloth. And I've been around the country to talk to villagers, and some of them are in floods of tears, saying, for the first time, we feel like a citizen. And they say, it's not really the money, although that's nice. The most important thing is that we are trusted to make our own decisions. And the pride in their faces is really just overwhelming. And I think this system's now in Afghanistan, it's now in every single rural Indonesian village. And I think that the next generation of these type of programs, if this is the way to go, is how can we get the black boxes? How can this is an information network, it's a money distribution network. How could these kind of programs also be distribution networks for alternative energies?
Lynn, I'm just going to say, and how do we do this? How do we get these white boxes and black boxes into these communities? Who are the people who need to say yes? What is the role of governments? What's the role of international bodies like the UN? And what are the roles that that the private sector, whether philanthropic or business, can be doing?
Just on the private sector role in distributed electricity, if you use the Economist magazine's term micropower to mean both cogeneration or combined heat and power and distributed renewables, those two together now provide 1/6 of the world's total electricity, slightly more than nuclear, 1/3 of the world's new electricity, and in 13 industrial countries, anywhere from 1/6 to over half of all electricity. This is no longer a fringe activity. The renewable part alone got $56 billion of private risk capital last year. Nuclear got zero. What's going on here? It's very simple. Distributed power has lower costs and lower financial risks. So investors tend to put their money there. And it is only our energy institutions that fail to understand this. And you know, the revolution already happened, but they missed it.
Lynn, perhaps you can also help us fill in, and how do we spread this out into these 40, 60 failed states or fragile states? And presumably, and Jim, you know, please feel free to jump in, if we were able to bring distributed civic power as well as energy into these fragile communities, to what extent are we going to have a safer world?
So two thoughts. First of all, Eric alluded to the need to communicate and collaborate with civil military partners. I'd go a little farther. If the Defense Department cannot communicate, collaborate, perhaps translate, and engage effectively beyond the boundaries of the defense enterprise with civil military partners, will never get security clearances with unclassified information, not the kind of classified things we normally do. You cannot achieve the social, political, and economic goals for which the military force was committed in the first place. This is not a nice-to-have adjunct to the kinetic phases of war. It is a critical part of the national strategy from the beginning of an operation. And that needs to be not only thought through the communications and collaboration piece, but what do we do with it? What message do we send? How do we establish trust? The second piece, to reinforce what Claire was saying, in 2002, RMI held a charrette on sustainable settlements. And out of that has come something called the Expedient Infrastructures for Transient Populations, which is basically an effort to provide rapidly deployable shelter, power, sanitation, cooking facilities, energy, and perhaps information and communications technologies like identification. How do you identify people in a refugee camp? So the Red Cross is hosting a meeting on the 27th of August to support this. There are handouts and a piano out there. We welcome the support from people in this group. This is intended to be a private sector government partnership, and would love to take advantage of the enormous energy and brain power in this group. It's all part of the common piece. How do you engage? How do you establish trust? How do we handle, set the conditions that the people on the ground need, not what we think they need, what the people on the ground need to go forward.
Lynn, I think you and Eric were among those instrumental in changing U.S. doctrine almost 2 years ago so that stability operations now have equal priority with combat operations. How is that playing out in practical effect? How long will it take for the institution to realize that these rules have changed?
I think what you find in any large organization is that the seniors get it pretty well, and the juniors get it pretty well, and it's the mid-level of the organization that takes a long time to get it. And in some cases, you will never actually get the change until the mid-levels of the organization shuffle off the stage.
And what is the capacity building that we need to do to get that middle to change? What are some of the most effective things that you've come across?
Well, I mean, the one reason why I'm looking forward, one of the several reasons I'm looking forward to this new job I have as Chair of Force Transformation, is a chance to get into the schoolhouse and get into the education of the mid-grade and sort of lower senior level officers to begin to try to convey some of this to them. Because they're coming out of command tours, they're coming out of the field, and this is a chance to say, okay, this is what you saw on the ground, now how can we change the organization to do better going forward?
Jim.
There's a chapter I've contributed to a book on global warming and national security. It's out on the piano, and one aspect of it is a joint energy planning exercise between a tree hugger and a hawk. And the tree hugger is the ghost of John Muir, and the hawk is the ghost of George S. Patton. What is interesting about that dialogue is that Patton and Muir don't share one another's objectives. Muir's worried about carbon, Patton's worried about terrorists. But it turns out they slowly discover in the course of talking to one another that what they want to do is pretty much the same thing. Get away from oil, get onto distributed generation of electricity, etc. Well, we have in this country, and I think internationally, a lot of groups that have their own perfectly legitimate interests 87 major evangelical Christian organizations came out a year or so ago in favor of moving away from fossil fuels. You can be an absolutely committed total atheist and not share any of those values at all and think, well, they say they don't want to sink Bangladesh beneath the waves with global warming because it's not Christian to do that. So if that's their reason, they're doing good things, not sinking Bangladesh beneath the waves. Just as Patton and Muir can agree you want to get away from oil, each for his own reasons. One of the mistakes we have made in this whole area is to try to convince everybody who's connected with it that our motives are the right one, and if we just insist on them more intently and more loudly, we'll prevail. And that's completely the wrong approach. All right? It's Patton and Muir, believe me, they can work it out.
Now, I'm very conscious that we're in a very wealthy, very beautiful part of the United States. We're in Aspen. But if we were having this conversation in Europe, would the conversation have this flow? And if we were having this conversation in Asia, would the conversation have this flow? What would be the issues that would be at the forefront of people's minds when we discuss resource efficiency and security and failed states? Eric, I know you've had some experience in this area.
Interesting. I am about to go teach a little bit in China. That'll be my first exposure there, but I spent some time in Southeast Asia, including in Singapore back in April. And between I used to teach at the United Nations, OCHA, in Geneva. And looking at those two perspectives in contrast to those that I work around most days, it is interesting to recognize the outside of the US emphasis on the provision of social services for peace, for security, for stability. Momentary anecdote there. I have a photograph that I took in Basra in April of 2003, where there was a pile of garbage along the street, main street, on fire. And on asking around, it turns out that garbage on fire in Basra is no more reasonable than garbage on fire in Cleveland. It showed a significant breakdown in social services, and the population, not surprisingly, had to turn somewhere to reestablish that social structure. Now, Hamas makes a practice of that. I've worked in Gaza. If you talk to anyone in Gaza about Hamas, you have the way that medicines are delivered, the way widows are taken care of, the way kids get to school. It's a social service organization. We don't often see it that way, but that's how it is there. Same kind of thing happened in Iraq. Social services underwent a significant deterioration, and we were not there with the social service capacity to rebuild that structure and reestablish trust. The Brits that I worked with, is that an impolite term? I don't think so. The British that I worked with, sorry Claire, in Basra and in Qasr, the port that we had to get open so quickly, were going around by the third day in soft caps without the vests visible and with sidearms in their pockets, walking around in teams, kicking soccer balls with the kids on the street. When those of us who were showing up in flak jackets and helmets and heavy weapons and all the rest said, you look kind of confident. They told me that they've done Northern Ireland for 30 years and they know how this works. And the first thing you have to do is establish rapport, get an understanding of what the community needs, and move forward. I think in Europe, to return laboriously to your question, I apologize. I think in Europe we would hear that level of social engagement and understanding of capacity for doing stability operations without the heavy security emphasis is much more developed than it is within the US military, to make some broad generalizations.
And what was your sense in talking about these issues when you were in Singapore?
That was my first time in Singapore. Many of you in the room will probably be familiar with that island. I found that when you are very small and very wealthy and surrounded by people who do not like you, and you're responsible for something on the order of 1/3 of the world's banking and something on the order of 1/3 of the world's shipping, you are an attractive nuisance to your neighbors. And so you learn diplomacy, and you learn placement, and you learn Aikido. Right? Right? You learn how to flow with the forces around you. On the list of lessons I took away from a very rich few days on that island, with some very, very smart people, that was high on the list of lessons. That to work with the forces surrounding you is much better than imposing the force you can bring to bear.
Anybody else like to share some thoughts?
Generally, I would say, not universally, but generally speaking, Americans have focused, because of 9/11, first and foremost on the malevolent threats, and the Europeans on the malignant threats. And so you often have a kind of a dialogue of the deaf, as they have been trying to tell us to pay attention to global warming, for example, and we've been trying to tell them to pay attention to terrorism, and it's a war, and they say, don't call it a war, that's terrible, it's just law enforcement, and so back and forth like that. And the real problem is that both are right. These are both really serious problems. We need to pay attention to them, work together on them, and but it's not easy. I've been in a number of dialogues like this, and tried to get my American friends and European friends to join on saying these are both important, but it's a struggle.
One of the interesting, I was in Singapore about the same time Eric was, and one of the interesting things I took away from that was that they made several years ago a strategic investment in water quality. And basically they're dependent, or were dependent a few years ago, on getting all their water, almost all their water, across a causeway from Malaysia, which of course led to a strategic vulnerability. So the investment was in what kind of radically new techniques of water purification can one develop. So they're now at the stage where the island, the nation, is independent in water because of the new desalination plants they brought online. But they're also able to take the water that comes across the causeway from Malaysia at 3 cents a something, I don't know, 100 cubic feet or whatever it is, and sell it back to purify it and sell it back to them at 26 cents. And now the Malaysians are complaining that they're becoming profiteers over what had been a strategic vulnerability. The other thing, to take Jim's point, is about 2 years ago, in an effort to do better at strategic communications, there's a DoD group called the Highlands Forum, which looks at the interface between policy and technology. And it embarked on about a year-long effort on strategic listening. Just before we start communicating, what happens if we just listen to what our target audience is trying to say? And that turned out to be an extraordinarily valuable effort.
Claire?
Hear a lot just by listening.
I'm biased because I've chosen to move my project from Europe to the US. So I think Europe has a lot to learn from this country. A couple of elaborations on that. I think this country has a very healthy suspicion of big government and big UN organizations. And the Europeans still have this trust in the UN agencies and NGOs being able to sort everything out. I think another element of characteristic of the US potentially as an observer is that this country has an incredible imagination and ability to reinvent itself and appetite for trying new things. And I found that in the way that this country is really trying to rethink stability operations. If there's a new idea, people say, fantastic, how can we help you? In Europe, generally people will say, this other approach has worked for 200 years, why should we change it? So again, I put my faith in the US for rethinking these problems.
Well, I think there are some cultural issues involved, obviously. I mean, coming from Asia, the idea of civic distributed power is politically incorrect. The East Asians, at least, that comes from Confucian traditions, we look at the almighty state, but of course, there is a vast difference between reality and theory. So, I mean, the idea of engaging big parts of the world that are rising power, that will increasingly want to engage in international diplomacy, how do we get them to buy in to some of these ideas, and also, to take some responsibility for failed states or failing states or fragile states around the world? Claire, do you have a view on how we engage some of the rising powers in Asia?
couple of reflections was I just witnessed a group of Norwegian diplomats who, treading with a lot of suspicion and trepidation, went to China to explore with the Chinese leadership, say, would you get involved in this new area? And found to their complete surprise and delight, there was enormous interest and engagement. And I think it's been part of the mental model of the US, UK, traditional European power axis, that they just actually haven't asked for engagement yet. And when they do ask, the response now is being incredibly positive. Singapore, one example, China now another. In the experience we're having in places like Sudan, Afghanistan, Nepal, India really wants to play a role. Recently, the previous head of the World Bank went to see the leader in India and said, what would you like the World Bank to be doing for you in 10 years? And he said, teaching India how to be a good donor. So I think there's enormous, if we engage in the right ways, we're going to get enormous benefit. The Gulf is another region. The Gulf wanted to play a role constructively, but just didn't find a way to sync with other efforts.
Interestingly, the Chinese State Council, the cabinet, has a strong working party that meets regularly to discuss how to advance Chinese soft power, in Joe Nye's term. That is, what can we do that will make China more attractive for others to align with, join with, rather than hard power, how do we compel others to do what we want? This is, of course, recently a big missing element in American foreign policy and strategy. And it's interesting that natural capitalism was published in China through the intervention of the top two ideologists in the Chinese Communist Party, who thought it was just what China needed at this stage of her development. One can find friends in unusual places.
Now, I'm going to ask Eric to make a few comments, but I know there are many questions that you would like to ask this distinguished panel. So if I can already start inviting people to go to the mic, I'm going to ask Eric to comment, and then we're going to come to you.
I suppose my comment could be very brief, and if you'll allow me a triviality, the way that we engage those upcoming powers in thinking about things we in this room consider valuable would first be to model that behavior, don't you think?
Jim, very quickly.
Just a very
yes.
short point. I think to work with China, you focus on at least a couple of things that China's very worried about. They're worried if there should be a conflict with us, say over Taiwan, that the U.S. Navy would be able to cut their sea lines of communications to the Persian Gulf and cut them off from oil. That's one reason, not the only one. They're very interested in renewable fuels. We can work with them on renewable fuels. There's no reason not to. We have a common interest in moving away from oil. Theirs is rooted in a somewhat different place than ours, but it's still there. And the same thing is true of their concern about pollution. I would hate, I don't know about you, to be a marathon runner in the Olympics coming up in China. They have got to do something about their pollution because it's a huge social problem for them. It causes demonstrations, riots, all sorts of unhappiness with the government. Well, one thing one can do to clean up the environment in the near surroundings is take a path that would also clean it up with respect to things like CO2, such as moving to renewable sources.
Your questions, please.
Jack Hittery. I want to pick up on a question, Christine, you asked before and some comments that Claire made. A few months after the United States entered Afghanistan, I was sent to Kabul by OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, to examine a number of issues related to the financial infrastructure and the physical infrastructure of the country. And underscoring some of the points that were made before in terms of the World Bank and others having a lot of money to rebuild old infrastructure, but suddenly having no mandate, seemingly, to actually think about new ideas, new ways to look at new kinds of distributed power, distributed types of facilities. One of the funny things I saw when I went to visit the World Bank headquarters in Kabul is that it's surrounded and protected by shipping containers, because they use the easy thing, the kind of black box available at the time, to plop in to protect its own facilities. Went outside of Kabul a little bit. I saw a store, little grocery store. It was made inside a shipping container. Sun Microsystems just announced a few months ago they've created a data center that you can plop anywhere in the developing world, anywhere you want to, made in a shipping container. Dean Kamen stuff can be put in shipping containers. So even though the World Bank doesn't have this mandate, they're actually de facto use some of the same kind of black box technology to defend and protect themselves. But back to the larger question of the relation between the financial infrastructure, Hawala, as Claire knows well, I went and visited and changed money with a lot of Hawala. These are the informal money changing systems in places like Afghanistan. No records, no computers, just, cousins in different places and so on and so forth. In places where Hawala are prevalent, informal markets, things like that, how do we relate these kind of informal financial institutions to the kind of new distributed power systems, distributed infrastructure that we want to see in these countries? Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Well, I guess they're relationships of trust, but anyone from the panel might like to comment? Claire?
Sure. I think one of the things when external people go to countries is that they don't stop to map what's already there and working. And but a natural capitalism approach would do that. Look at the assets, all the different types from natural capital to financial capital that are there. And absolutely, places like Afghanistan, they didn't have telephone systems, but you could get a message from one end of the country to the other. Passing cars would just relay it, passing donkeys and mules. The same money you can get from one village to one on the opposite end of the country through this Hawala system. No idea how they do it, but it works. And actually the National Solidarity Program used the Hawala system to get the block grants of $20,000 to the village. So it does work. And I think the way to do it is how can we mesh our Western organizations' ideas, capital, knowledge with the domestic systems that are already there and working. And that's one of the challenges.
Lynn.
So one of the really interesting things we've been exploring from the information and communications technology point of view has been lightweight, cheap identification systems for use in third world situations. Could you take, for example, a picture of somebody in a cell phone, turn that into a two-dimensional barcode that could then become an identification card that could be used in a refugee camp, used for distribution of food, whatever. What I don't understand, and what I would look forward to working more closely with Claire and others on, is what's the interaction between that and the social networks? I mean, there actually is pretty good technology to be able to bring identification that lets you remain both anonymous. Essentially reveals only that information needed for a transaction. You don't need to reveal where you were born, what your income is, how many family members you have, just that you're this person who gets this bag of rice today. But again, the intersection of the culture will be very interesting.
And I think just building on that very much, one of the things that I've found Nepali citizens, Afghan citizens want more than anything is their own identity. And they actually see that not as a threat to civil liberties, but a right. And we're going to have to keep the balance between that. But if people can have their own identity attached to their person, then that could liberate them to be able to receive direct payments for their salaries instead of the warlords taking a chunk out of it, mortgages and so on, when you don't have secure property title. So it could be a huge empowerment device.
Yes.
Excuse me, this has been a great panel, and I wanted to pick up on the soft power concept. Obviously, with brittle power in 1980, it became clear as an excellent security argument, and winning the oil game buttresses that considerably. And around the time brittle power came out, there was another book, Energy for a Sustainable World, that showed that if you wanted to alleviate poverty, the fastest route, you would follow the same route that Amory laid out in Soft Path. And of course, from a biodiversity perspective, the similar argument that if you don't want Exxon to talk about putting orangutans in your tanks for palm oil palm to fuel displacement of gasoline, this route makes sense as well. So you have a spherically sensible argument, and yet, just this recent energy bill in Congress, we have Senator Domenici inserting at the last minute $50 billion in guarantees for large-scale nuclear power plants. It seems like the type of thing that the security community should be informing the legislative branch that instead of trying to help China build clusters of nuclear power plants, we should instead have a Highland Forum of bringing the military leaders of both countries and say, we can do a soft power strategy that alleviates poverty, helps clean up the environment, and leaves us all more financially well off. So I'm wondering, how realistic is that for the securities of those two countries coming together? Since I read everything in the literature of this escalation of China's building for conflict and the U.S. for conflict, it just seems the wrong path entirely.
I know, Amory, you want to come in. Amory, Jim, and then Lynn.
The U.S. example in, say, the nuclear case is critical because, of course, if a country with our wealth, technical prowess, and fuel says, we have to have nuclear power, we're inviting everybody else in the world to draw the same conclusion. What you then have is subsidized do-it-yourself bomb kits all over the place in civilian disguise. Now, if instead we actually accepted the market verdict and didn't say we can have as many reactors as the taxpayers are willing to pay for if Senator Domenici sneaks in a sentence nobody knew was there, then guess what? The ingredients for making bombs would be harder to get. They'd be more conspicuous to try to get. They'd be politically costlier to be caught trying to get. Because now there'd be no doubt what you're up to is making bombs, not electricity. And this wouldn't make proliferation impossible, but it would make it a lot harder. And we'd be more likely to notice it timely because intelligence resources could be focused on needles, not haystacks. So when the president correctly says that the spread of nuclear bombs is the biggest threat to our security, it seems rather curious that he's doing everything possible to drive it as fast as possible. And in fact, I was recently briefing U.S. Strategic Command the ways in which the biggest threat to our energy security is our energy policy. It is prolonging dependence on oil with all of the malignant effects that Jim so eloquently describes. It is making our infrastructure ever more brittle and vulnerable, whether to Katrina or to attack. It is putting new fat terrorist targets near our cities. Its centerpiece is still creating an all-American Strait of Hormuz on the north slope of Alaska and calling this the centerpiece of energy security. And of course, it's incontinently spreading nuclear weapons around. So my message to the military professionals was, if these are not the national security outcomes you want, it is your duty to say so. And there were a lot of nodding heads. I think we're going to be hearing more of that.
Oh, I certainly agree with that. I think that what one has to do is strip the national security patina away from what is, in effect, just economic interest lobbying. For example, for nuclear power plants. For example, for coal to liquid. These things are not really contributing, and nuclear energy, for exactly the reason Amory says, detracting from national security, but it is easy for a communications officer for a corporation or whatever to draft up something that makes it sound that way, and for some lobbyists to work the problem. What you really need to do is engage with the people who are sincerely, principally interested in national security, not in helping the nuclear power industry or not in helping coal to liquid industry, and get them into the scrap, because they're your best allies. A wonderful man, Jack Jacobson, had an op-ed yesterday in the New York Times. What people who don't know him didn't know is that he won the Medal of Honor in Vietnam for saving about 25 of his men, carrying them out under fire while half of his skull was hanging off from a shell. You need people like Jack. What would be wrong with pulling together a group of Medal of Honor winners to work with the environmental community, for example, on real national security interests? There are a lot of people out there who are eager and willing to help on these things, including two gentlemen here who spent their lives in the military. But you got to go get them and motivate them and pull them along, because they need to be shown that what they want to accomplish and what the environmental community wants to accomplish have a huge degree of overlap.
With regard to the China parts of the discussion, I mean, everything I know about the discussion that's going on within the senior leadership of the U.S. Defense Department, at least, says if we ever go to war with China, shame on both of us. There ought not to be fundamental, core, long-term conflicts of interest that would lead these two nations to war, and we ought to find a way through it. That said, one of the most far-reaching views of this, I thought, was taken by former Secretary Bill Perry back in the early 90s. And we had crafted a document that was going to go to North Korea, and at that time there was a thing called Kim Il-sung. And he said, look, we craft this document, we dot every I, we cross every T, we set up the North Korean intersection in New York, which gets translated by someone through a mask of Juchi. and then sent off to Pyongyang, where it's delivered by some sycophantic lackey in the foreign ministry. And I have no clue what message is actually being delivered to the person we're trying to get it to. I don't ever want to be in this position with China. And I want a series of exchange programs beginning now between the field grade officers, the lieutenants and the captains and the majors, so that 20 years from now, when they're generals and admirals, we have multiple channels of communication. He was savaged by the Congress. In fact, I believe Perry, and I believe the Congress actually somewhere in 93, 94 put in legislation that says, you will not have these exchange programs because those Chi-Coms in our midst would steal so much out of our, no. So, for those of you who have influence on the Hill and that sort of thing, this is a citizen lobbying effort that could be encouraged as well, because we shot ourselves in the foot on that.
I want to ask a question that I raised last night, because the panel is begging this question again, which is the logic here is indisputable. And it's as clear as day. Imre, your logic about eating our tail, shortening our supply chains in Iraq it's indisputable. Jim, you know how much I agree with your point on we're not just funding the other side of the war, we're actually funding a transformation of Islam to its most hardline and intolerant version, which is going to have enormous implications for over 1 billion people. But we're 6 years from September 11th. And we're about to have an election, as far as I can tell, 535 people in the Congress, Senate, and not a single one is running on a gasoline tax. You'd think somebody just on a flyer would say, what the hell, I'm going to lose anyways. I'll take a flyer, $1 a gallon, what the hell, you know what I mean? And people, when I ask politicians about this, they say, well, the other side will use it against. I'd love to be in that debate. I'd love to be in the debate where my opponent says, now my opponent, Mr. Friedman's for $1 a gallon gasoline tax. You know what that's going to cost you? And I'd love to be able to say, well, let's get one thing clear. We're both for a tax. My opponent wants his to go to the Saudi Treasury. I prefer mine to go to the US Treasury. That's got to win a debate somewhere. Somewhere that's got to, it's got to work with somebody. Why isn't it happening? No, I get my aggravation playing golf. Thank you.
Well, members of the panel, how are you going to energize this debate for the forthcoming US elections?
Can I pose a slightly different question? But I think it's, science is teeing up for us, whether we like it or not, a series of really fundamental issues. These are things like directed evolution. These are things like synthetic biology. These are things like, treating pandemics by looking at your antibodies, and at what point would the American people be willing, in addition to taking off their shoes at the TSA checkpoint, giving a drop of blood with the possibility of being quarantined in the face of a pandemic influenza. The point is, there is no forum for the political or the legal or the ethical or the philosophical discussion of these issues in the United States today. It's just like we don't touch the third rail of the energy. There are a whole batch of other issues that will affect the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the American people that are just off the table. And you all out there are a community of folks who might be able to influence some of that. And I would love to be able to get to the George Stephanopoulos and Condi Rice's of the candidates for the now running, to sort of say, I know your candidate's not going to want to touch this third rail issue, but on November 9th, 2008, before the deluge of transition books descend upon them, I hope somebody has had the conversation with them that says, this is going to be an important issue that you're going to have to think about, and that they will have thought about it before they go in to the election.
Can I just add something? I mean, this sounds deeply disappointing to me, coming from the other side of the world, that if in America, during critical political times, when you're having important elections, and that people like yourselves are saying that important discussions are just not on the table, or can't be on the table. that's deeply depressing from those of us who come from the other side of the world where certain things are not even supposed to be on the table. So educate me about American politics.
Well,
Let me try. I think, in answer to that and Tom's question, I've got a friend of some 30 years standing who's running for president who specializes in taking unpopular positions named John McCain, and maybe I could persuade, John that it's a possibility. But nonetheless, I think that there is less driving reason to do the gasoline tax or oil tax than there was a few years ago because of electricity. What has happened to the batteries is this absolutely skyrocketing capability for cost. What happened to computer technology in the 80s and 90s. And we are, as soon as we get a plug-in hybrid in a dealer's showroom, people are going to be able to drive for 20, 30 miles at 1/10 the cost of what they're driving on for gasoline. Off-peak overnight power roughly is a penny a mile, 1 to 2 cents a mile compared to 12, 14, 15 cents for gasoline. Furthermore, with vehicle-to-grid hookups, which Amory's been writing about for years, you can make money by leaving your car plugged in. So you go into a dealer's showroom, and he says, I've got this new Chevy Volt, and it's a nice-looking little car. You might be interested in a couple of things. One is you'll be able to drive at 1/10 the cost you are now, and the other is that the dealer will pick, your local utility will pick up about half your car payments. Are you interested? And furthermore, and it's in this paper out there, from an environmental reason, a global warming point of view, and also not needing new baseload electricity, you're in very good shape moving to electricity for car propulsion. The alternative liquid fuels, which would be the ones that would be the best helped by a gasoline tax or an oil tax, I think are going to be kind of in second place. And what we really needed an oil tax for, or a gasoline tax, was to keep the Saudis from doing what they did in the mid-'80s, and again to some extent in the late '90s, dropping the bottom out of the oil market by turning on the reserve capacity and bankrupting their competitors, like the stupid Senfuels Corporation. Well, I honestly believe that electricity for cars is going to make it really impossible for them to do that. They can't drop the price enough to compete with off-peak overnight electricity. And also, they got pressure from Indian and Chinese demand to keep the oil price up, and Matt Simmons may be right. They may be running into pressure from peak oil. Certainly the Kuwaitis have just dropped their estimate of how much oil reserves they have by about 65% in the last couple of 3 weeks. So stay tuned. I think from a point of view of principle and from the point of view that it would move things along, I agree with moving toward an oil tax or a gasoline tax. But electricity is coming up on the inside rail, and it may do a lot that tax would have done just on its own.
Now, I'm just going to, Amy, I'm going to ask you to hold it because I see a line of people who've been standing there for a while. Also, what I'd like to do, before we end this panel, I'm going to invite each one of you to say a few words about what you would like to see happen next, and what you and what you think who should do what to make your dream come true. So give yourselves a minute to think about that. Please, your question.
All right, my question's about oil and coal. And if I were in the oil and coal business making the type of money they're making right now, I would not want to stop making that money. I would fight pretty hard, I think, to make sure I still was able to keep making that kind of money. But we all know that if oil and coal keep making that kind of money, that means carbon's in the air and it's not going to solve the situation. So what's the positive on that? What's the solution to bringing those industries, how do you get someone who's making that kind of money to change their ways and to change their business?
Now, I've just been told we have 7 minutes, so hold that question. Somebody needs to answer it. I'm going to take all your questions at the same time so that the panel can quickly answer them before they go into their final statements, because I don't want any of you not to have an opportunity to make your comment.
Thank
Please.
you. Jen Hamilton, PhD in human ecology. My question concerns health, and I think I speak for women globally when I say that we choose not to live alone for the last 20 or 30 years of our lives. So as we look at the databases related to what's appearing to soon become the #1 killer, cancer, And as those tumors are dissected and we find pollutants, xenobiotics, toxins in those tumors, what data do you see coming forth, current studies, or in the countries that are the most prudent with regard to the recommendations we've heard today? What are we seeing in terms of health and cancer in those countries? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Tom Arts from Advanced Fuel Sciences. My question is also about oil and the oil tax as a simple solution, which has come up a couple times today. But I was going to challenge the panel to say, is there another, because tax is a dirty word, and if it does solve everything, it's great, but it's not always what is the right solution that works. It's what can get through the system, and the system isn't always working right. So is there another way than oil tax to actually help solve the oil endgame that Amy writes about so much? And the second question on that is, if there's an carbon reduction technology, can you really trust the Chinese to work with them, which I know is a big issue given what the potential of the differences are between our countries? Thank you.
Russell Alexi, H-Tech, small business owner. I think the real issue is, I think empathy and communication is very important to the people you're interacting with, and something we need to harvest within ourselves. How do we nurture that, the next generation of decision makers, whether they're private or political, who are going to be making those decisions in the future?
Okay, that's a good variety of questions. Shall we take the two oil questions together? Amory.
Yeah, let me have a crack at those. Oil or gasoline taxes are a strong signal to drive less. They're a very weak signal to buy an efficient car in the first place, because they're diluted like 6 to 1 by all the other costs of owning and running the car, and then they're very heavily discounted. That's why in Europe, say you can drive around in Britain or in Norway with $7 a gallon gasoline, and all the cars around you are at most 10 or 15% more efficient than they are here. So that could be helpful, but I think fee-baits are much more powerful and politically attractive. And what we've got to get out of is this 20-year gridlock where the oil companies say we must have higher efficiency standards for cars, car makers say we must have higher gasoline taxes, and these two titanic lobbies fight each other to a draw, and nothing happens. So I think fee-baits may be a way forward there. On the question about oil and coal companies, Winning the Oil Endgame, you may have noticed, has a foreword not just by George Shultz, but also by Sir Mark Moody Stewart, the former chairman of Shell. And it's been very well received by most of the oil industry. By the way, even ExxonMobil's technical analysts had come to very similar conclusions. It's just their economic forecasters that didn't get it. And the short answer on what happens to oil companies in the world that buys no oil is whoever owns the oil, which is typically not oil companies, actually makes more money in a world that doesn't buy oil. And the reason is that the hydrogen in your hydrocarbons is worth more without the carbon than with the carbon, even if no one pays you to keep carbon out of the air. That's because you can use hydrogen so much more efficiently than hydrocarbons that you will make more money taking hydrogen out of your hydrocarbons in a reformer than putting more hydrogen into your hydrocarbons in a refinery, which is what we do now. The major oil companies have pretty well figured this out now. And the same logic applies to coal. In a climate-constrained world, you can't burn all that coal, and that would be a lousy use of it anyway. The highest value use of coal assets is to pull hydrogen out of steam. It's really good at that. And of course, you have to do it in a carbon-sequestered way, but the product is valuable enough it will probably make money. So by now, 3 of the world's top 5 coal-producing companies have figured this out and are revaluing their assets through the strategic lens of the hydrogen value chain. That's the right way to do it.
Well, we have 2 other questions. One was on the future generations, and the other one is on public health. Would anybody like to have a go at one of them? Both of them?
I will defer to Dr. Eric on the health question, but a brief comment. I think in a lot of the countries we see the data is absolutely terrible. And we've started to build an index, and we've been tracking through all the different indices. They all come down to a group of people in the country. They all borrow from each other. And people say, you go and talk to those people, and they say, please don't use our data. We made it up. And for example, in Afghanistan, there are somewhere between 15 and 25 million people in the country. Those kind of statistics just don't exist. And we've got to be taking a much more data-driven approach and starting with statistics. On the empathy and communications, couldn't agree more. The kind of program that Lynn was describing, exchange programs with China, what Eric has been trying to do with incredibly successfully with Strong Angel, bringing together, he even got Google and Microsoft working together. How do you create these situated environments where people will collaborate, learn from each other, and develop these flexible mental models, which are going to be critical for leadership in an interdependent world?
Eric, can you say a few words about public health? And then you can follow in straight into what would be your final words.
Sure. The question of public health is an interesting one. All of us are familiar with the cost of energy use through wood fuels and charcoal on mostly women, and the pulmonary diseases that result from that. That's a little different from what was being asked in the question, which is industrial pollutants and long-term contamination that is being detected in breast milk, even in the Inuit. These are studies that need to be done. They're considered in public health a bit of a niche problem, which is regrettable because the consequences are going to resonate throughout generations. There are going to be alterations in the capacity to think in these children that even when adequately nourished, will have metabolites that are inappropriate and impair neurological function. A study that just, that body of work is just barely unfolding. And there are those that consider the precautionary principle nonsense. I'm not one of those. That can be discussed in some other venue. Final thoughts? Mine are the simple ones. I would like a rebalancing of the, well, let's call it a reequilibration of the constitutional balance of powers. I have been wounded twice in wars that I consider illegal and immoral, and an executive branch took responsibility where a legislative branch should have had equal consideration, and those decisions were not equally distributed as they should have been, and the consequences for those like me have been severe. I'd like a Congress that is once again fully responsible for its constitutional responsibilities. I'll leave it at that.
Lynn, some final thoughts.
Two things. I'd like to see DOD make the kind of investments in the energy area that might have the sort of societal level impacts that things like ARPANET and GPS and high-speed integrated circuits had. And second, I'd like to see a total approach to national security, total approach to building partner capacity, stabilization, reconstruction that brings to bear the State Department, the other aspects, the private sector particularly, so that young men and women in uniform are less likely to be put in places where they will be at risk of their lives and their well-being.
On electricity, the step that's in the House bill that President Clinton mentioned yesterday to decouple for the whole country, electricity for public utility commissions, earnings from revenues, so that when the other states act like California and let utilities earn money by modernizing and saving energy rather than just by putting out more electricity. Moving heavily toward distributed generation, including cogen, combined heat and power, and of course the building efficiencies, which Amory and RMI have been so famous for pushing for a long time. Those three steps, probably encouraged by a carbon cap and trade system of some sort, would seem to me to head us rather decisively in a positive direction on electricity. For vehicles, the tax credits that are in the House bill on plug-in hybrids is a very good step in the right direction. As I said before, I think that's the quickest way to move away from oil.
Claire?
I think what this panel has done wonderfully is identify not only the convergence between the energy efficiency and climate change agenda with this post-9/11 security agenda, but also the poverty and social exclusion of 2 billion people on this planet who are currently excluded from opportunities. And my plea would be, how can we harness the incredible knowledge, imagination, and scientific advances so that these advances work for the poor as well as the advanced countries?
Final word is yours, Amory.
I think the nexus between energy, resources, environment development, and security is ever clearer with this conversation. RMI has not had a real security program since Hal Harvey left. He ran it originally. I would like to revitalize that effort because I think really the time has come for a lot of the ideas we've been developing these 25 years. Just in the short term, I'd like to refill our military principal position to push the military energy efficiency agenda. The Pentagon is one of our most powerful, important, and influential allies in leading the nation off oil, so they needn't fight over oil. We can have neg emissions in the Gulf, mission unnecessary, and they really like that idea.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience and your time. Please thank the panel for their wonderful contributions.